Okay, Chapter 10 Presentation Another New Nation, looking at the first few years of our early republic and how we handle it. So, beginning with the growing pains our nation faces, the main focus here is that the population continues to skyrocket, doubling every 25 years, and that pace will continue throughout most of the 1800s. Another key thing here would be that America's population is 90% rural, which tells you that many Americans are going to be farmers and frontiersmen, which will tell us a lot about the political future that we're headed toward. All but 5% are living east of the Appalachians, so mostly located on those coasts, but that will rapidly change. So, George Washington is chosen unanimously as the President of the United States by the Electoral College, the only president to ever be chosen unanimously. He didn't campaign or angle for it. That's a much more modern invention as far as how we view political parties and campaigning for president. He relied on the strength of his character and of his reputation as a general and leader throughout the Revolutionary period over arts of a politician. Upon becoming president, he created the presidential cabinet. Now, interestingly, the presidential cabinet is not specified in the Constitution, but it is a tradition that began with George Washington. It allows him to organize their administration and delegate responsibilities to people they think can do a good job with those uh, categories. So we have the Secretary of State, Jefferson, chosen by Washington. He was to represent us and do all of our international affairs. Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton. He runs our economy and helps plan out what we should do with it. And then Secretary of War, Henry Knox. So as you can see, Jefferson and Hamilton are both bolded and underlined there because they're going to be the most impactful members of his cabinet, and they'll debate on exactly what he should be doing as president. When our nation first began, a lot of anti federalists feared that the new federal government under the Constitution would rob us of our rights. And a large part of that is because while states had a list of rights in their state constitutions, the Constitution itself did not provide any protection for the rights of Americans. And so Madison creates the Bill of Rights, or he knew that creating a Bill of Rights was going to be key to uniting the country and make sure that the Constitution was supported. His first attempts to pass the Bill of Rights, however, was met with some serious opposition. And that's because when you put all the amendments together into one bill, they're going to naturally oppose the wording to one or the other. And so what he had to do is choose to create individual amendments. And so that's why the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments added to the Constitution, because he pushed, or rather, he supported 27 separate amendments. And those were all whittled down until they found the 10 that they thought were most important, and that will be adapted or added on to the Constitution. The first 8 amendments you know probably pretty well, even if you can't recite them. You have the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to bear arms, you have the quartering. Then you have a lot of legal things like your right to a jury trial, no cruel and unusual punishment, right to representation, all kinds of things. But for the sake of this class, we'll focus more on the 10th. That's because of the political implications we see going forward. The 10th Amendment said that if all rights, it says that all rights not explicitly delegated or given to the federal government is left to the states. So the 10th Amendment is used as a defense for states' rights throughout our history. And as we see in the 1800s, it will be the center of debate, especially as it pertains to tariffs and as it pertains to the issue of slavery going forward. So the Bill of Rights protects our rights as American citizens, and without it, there probably would not have been as many people supporting the Constitution. So when our nation begins, we have an absolute shambles of an economy. And Hamilton, as the Secretary of the Treasury, is given responsibility for fixing it. And so that's why we have his financial plan. And for the sake of this class, I have the acronym BFAT, Bank of the United States, Excise Tax, Funding at Par, Assumption of States Debts, and Tariffs. So his first goal was to make sure that other nations trusted investing in and trading with the U.S. In order to do that, he had to fund at par. What funding at par means is that we pay off our debts headed towards zero. Par means basically even. And so by paying our debts towards zero, even if we don't always get those debts paid off, showing a commitment to be able to pay it off consistently and head towards zero builds trust with other people. It's the same way that a credit rating works today. If you get a higher credit rating when you show that you can consistently pay your debts off, or at least every month meet the requirement they ask of you. So, with that idea in mind, funding at par, he set about making sure that we could consolidate all of the debts together. So, states they owed their own amount of debt. So you can see from this example, federal domestic debt was 42 million, but states themselves owed about 21 million as well. So, in order to consolidate all these debts into one payment and to make it easier to show that we're paying our debts off, uh, Hamilton pushed for the assumption of states' debts by the federal government. These states' debts would then be erased as far as owing other bodies like foreign nations or banks, but they would owe money to the federal government. So wealthy creditors would leave behind the states to deal with the federal government alone. The problem is, many states did not like this plan. They didn't like the idea of owing the federal government something because now they would have something hanging over each state's head. And considering going back to that 10th Amendment, many states wanted to be independent and have these powers reserved to themselves. They didn't like the idea of the federal government controlling them economically. The way that Hamilton gets this controversial plan to pass is he is able to negotiate with Southerners who opposed it, like James Madison, and he's able to get the the capital of our nation, moved to Washington D.C., a brand new city, and in return they agreed to support his assumption of states' debts. So it took a backroom deal in order to get the first part of his plan passed. This brings us to how to pay this debt off. So now that we have all this debt, how on earth can you pay it off? So first of all, Hamilton believed a manageable debt was a benefit. Again, thinking of that idea of a credit rating, showing you can pay it off, it makes people more willing to loan you more money and invest more. So in order to pay off the debt, you need taxes to pay it off. So there are two different taxes that he puts on, and that is first the tariff, which was an 8% tax on dutiable imports. In other words, a tax on imported goods. Taxes or this tariff would not only raise revenue for the country and help pay off any debts that we owed, but it would also protect infant industry. When you charge a tax on foreign goods coming into our country, that makes Americans more likely to buy homemade goods. And so Hamilton hoped that by us protecting this infant industry, that we would have our own industrial revolution in the United States. On top of this, he also passes an excise tax, and that's a tax on domestic goods. The most famous item that he taxed with this was whiskey. Whiskey was extremely plentiful. In fact, farmers west of the fall line in the Appalachian Mountains, it was pretty much the only way they could make money off their crops because transporting their crops to the east was too expensive. And so they would turn their wheat or their corn into whiskey and sell it for money. And so, with this much whiskey being made, similar to tea in the Revolutionary period, because it was so frequently drank, it was a very worthwhile item to tax because it would help us raise a lot of money. So then, one of the final piece of his plan is the Bank of the United States. So the Bank of the United States, Hamilton believed that it was needed in order to manage our federal funds and also to create a stable currency. If you remember during the Articles of Confederation period, we had every state with their own currency, and that made interstate trade and just traveling across state lines very difficult financially speaking. So if we could unite all of our funds under a stable currency, he believed it would be very effective. Problem is, a lot of people oppose this. So even after Congress passes the plan by a very close vote, George Washington has the option of vetoing it. So he asked Jefferson and Hamilton to write him letters to help him decide which he should do. So Jefferson uses, as we brought up earlier, the 10th Amendment. There is no clause in the Constitution which explicitly states that we can create a bank. He said it should be left to the states to create banking systems, and maybe then we could create a shared currency, but it was still under the state's power. So this is called strict construction or interpretation of the Constitution. If it is not stated explicitly in there, you cannot do it. It is left to the states. So his strict interpretation becomes a point of dispute and his defense against this Federalist plan and many plans going forward. Hamilton, meanwhile, used this clause and used something that we call the elastic clause, that claimed the government could pass laws, quote, necessary and proper. So the clause is necessary and proper, and the idea is that the federal government, from that clause, has the right to do things, even if not it says it directly. It has the right to do things that are necessary and proper to help our nation function. So in Hamilton's mind, creating a bank that gave us a shared currency and made sure our economy ran smoothly was within the bounds given by the Constitution. So this is called loose construction or interpretation of the Constitution. So these two men write out their arguments, and Washington is forced to decide, but he believes that Hamilton makes a more compelling case. And so Washington approves the bank, and the bank becomes law. Over time, we'll see a lot of resistance to the Bank of the United States, most of it coming from the agricultural South, who simply did not trust banks. So another part of that plan that is challenged over time is the Whiskey Rebellion. is the excise tax on whiskey. So farmers, since it was a major part of their income, hated this tax because they believed that it was hurting against their liberty and that they were being specifically targeted. So they defiantly cried, and you may recognize some of their ideas here: liberty and no excise. To them, this represented the same thing that the tea tax did in the Revolutionary period. So when they rise up, and they even begin building guillotines to support their little revolution here, Washington has the opposite response that the Articles of Confederation government had against Shays' Rebellion. Because the constitutional government had power, Washington is able to summon a militia, or really an army of 10,000 soldiers, and he goes out there and directly faces the Whiskey Rebellion people. When that happens, they quickly disperse. Now, what I like is Washington does not execute anyone, and no one is even given jail time. Rather, he was just trying to show that the new government under the Constitution would have the power to deal with mobs. Jefferson, meanwhile, claimed that it was an overreaction. He said that this is a proof that the federal government is growing too powerful and that there was no need for 10,000 soldiers to go out there. So we can see some divisions forming amongst Jefferson and Washington and the two political parties that are rising. But the biggest thing that the Whiskey Rebellion shows us is that the government under the Constitution has a lot more power than the Articles of Confederation government did. So, through the differences on the economic plans, on the view of states' rights in the 10th Amendment, and of course on how we deal with little rebellions and pushes against federal authority, we have the creation and emergence of the first political parties. These two political parties are called the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. These national political parties had not been planned or foreseen by our founding fathers, but it just kind of developed over time, and we're really rather rapidly, as you can see in these first few years. The two-party system, since their creation, has existed for pretty much our entire time period. So here you can see on this chart, Federalists founded in 1792, as well as Democratic Republicans, as Jefferson begins separating himself from Hamilton and Washington. The Federalist Party dies in 1816, and then we have a short time period where only one political party exists, and that ends when Andrew Jackson, creates his own political party when he does not win the presidential election of 1824. After that, you can see the National Republicans turning into the Whigs and Republicans, and the Democratic Republicans under Jackson turning into the Democrats. And now we have both those same political parties today. So we've always had a two political party system here. So, what about international relations under George Washington and our Constitution? Americans celebrated the French Revolution when it first broke out, but once they see people start getting beheaded left and right, many are not as excited. So, after the new government is created in France, France begins jockeying with Britain for power in Europe. Washington did not want to get involved, and the biggest reason for that is because he believed that we were too young and weak as a country to handle international conflict. So Washington issues a neutrality proclamation claiming the U.S. would not side with Britain or France. Of course, Jefferson, being a big fan of France, he is outraged and claims that Federalists were way too friendly to Britain, that we were abandoning the ideals that we had in our revolutionary period and abandoning our former allies. Citizen Edmond Genet, the French minister, even walks around America inciting Jeffersonians and many people to prepare for war against Britain. So Washington threatens to exile him. So what we see is Washington's dedication to neutrality and really showing that he was not willing to put us at risk. The biggest reason is, again, we are a weak, young country, and we needed to focus on developing our own nation rather than worry about what was going on halfway around the world. So, considering the British and why Jefferson had reason for disliking the British and wanting to support the French against them, the British had made neutrality quite difficult on us. They had seized over 300 U.S. merchant ships. They had impressed our sailors, basically meaning they boarded our ships and grabbed some of our sailors and forced them to become members of the British Navy. They had also kept posts on U.S. soil in the Northwest, trading fur with Native Americans, and also supporting them against American expansion. So this Miami Confederation of Native Americans fights us in the Northwest. Here you can see the territory that in Michigan and past the Ohio River Valley. You can see those British forts where they supported Native American activities against us. So we were able to defeat Little Turtle and his Miami Confederation at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and this forces them to sign a treaty giving up land. Britain does kind of abandon many of the Native Americans in that area after this, but they still continue to undermine our government. Hamilton himself fears that a war with them would undermine his developing economic program. He viewed Britain as a very useful trade ally. So when Washington tries to send Chief Justice John Jay to create peace with the British, uh, Hamilton actually undermines and sabotages those peace efforts because he wanted to keep a very positive relationship. So what we wanted was to force Britain to abandon the forts in the Northwest. We wanted them to pay for the damages. We wanted them to end the seizures and impressments of our sailors. But because Hamilton undermines his efforts, all Jay's treaty really gets is an agreement by Britain to stop. Which they don't. But again, it was a very weak treaty. And the funny thing about it, even though very little was agreed upon, the Democratic Republicans in Jefferson attacked Jay's treaty. So if you look at, they see it as a betrayal to the South, and the Democratic Republicans say they support France over Britain, and this is way too friendly. But when we look at Jay's treaty, it is the one mistake or black mark against George Washington's reputation in that time period, because people felt like we should have been a lot stronger in those negotiations. So as Washington leaves office, he is quite frustrated because he's tired of men like Jefferson dividing our country, questioning and challenging him. So Washington chooses to retire after just his second term as president. Now, what's awesome about his choice to retire is it sets a precedent all the way until Franklin Delano Roosevelt that presidents only serve 2 terms. So he shows a lot of humility in stepping down and showing that presidents don't serve for life. Instead, they serve for a time and then allow the torch to be passed to the next person. So as he leaves, he writes a farewell address, or rather, Hamilton writes it for him. And in this farewell address, he strongly advises 2 things. First of all, he advises us to avoid permanent alliances, that we should only create alliances with nations for emergencies. Later on, we will use this as a support for isolationism, stay out of world affairs. In fact, from the farewell address, we really don't have any major international conflicts outside of our own borders until World War I in 1917. At its time, however, this would have been seen as an attack against Jeffersonian Republicans who were so enamored with France they wanted us to risk getting into large-scale warfare with Britain. The second thing he warns against is the idea of the 2 political parties forming. Again, while today we look at that and we say that our founding fathers foresaw the dangers of 2 political parties, in their time period, this would have been seen as a slap at Jefferson, who was intentionally creating a party undermining Washington and his group. So what does George Washington accomplish as president? He creates a solid federal government. He keeps us out of foreign wars, even when it would have been easy to. He creates a 2-term tradition for presidents. That solid federal government not only represents the ability to handle mobs like the Whiskey Rebellion, but also puts into action the economic system with Hamilton that enables us to build a thriving country. So after George Washington, John Adams wins 71 to 68 with support from New England. So Jefferson was in second place and he had only lost by 3 votes. When John Adams, recognizing the difficulties and differences between the 2 men, invites Jefferson to help him run the nation in the White House, Jefferson actually declines to help him out and instead goes home to create his own political party and begin jockeying for the presidency in 1800. So Adams faced a lot of challenges. Amongst them, he did not get along with Hamilton, so that divides his political party. There's a building conflict with France throughout his presidency, and you also have Jefferson dividing the country. And then finally, he was honestly his own worst enemy, as he was not exactly the easiest person to get along with. So early on in his presidency, after Jay's treaty, France was afraid that we were creating an alliance with Britain, which couldn't have been farther from the truth, but hey, perception is truth in this case. So France is upset, so they also begin attacking our merchant ships. In order to try to continue the peace between ourselves and European countries, Adams sends 3 separate men to France to negotiate a peace. Amongst them, John Marshall, who we'll go over in future chapters. When they go there, they're stopped by 3 men who would only go by the terms X, Y, and Z, who demand a massive bribe just to meet with the French minister. So they demand $250,000 to meet with him and a loan of $32 million. And even though a lot of these small loans were part of just what the common practice was for negotiations in Europe, Americans refuse it and come back home. So we reject it. And what's amazing is early in John Adams' presidency, this is hailed as quite the success. By rejecting the XYZ affair, or the offer made in the XYZ affair as it came to be known, Americans were excited about us standing up to a European power. So during this time period, anti-French sentiment grows. and we come very close to coming to going to war with them. So after the XYZ affair, Congress pushes war preparations over Jeffersonian resistance because, of course, they supported France. We create a 10,000-man army. The Navy begins expanding, and we even create the Marine Corps. So this quasi-war, meaning half war or semi-war, basically not full-blown or declared war, but we certainly fight them, was confined primarily to the sea. 2.5 years of fighting over ships and over trade exist between the two countries, but never into full-blown invasion or land battles. The U.S. privateers, or our ships hired by the government, capture over 80 ships, but the U.S. themselves lose hundreds. So as many Americans see this as an infringement on our independence and demand that John Adams and Congress declare war, Adams refuses to negotiate, or rather refuses to declare war and prefers to negotiate. So he sends envoys to Paris in 1800, and the new leader, Napoleon Bonaparte, settles for peace with us. So even though Adams was right and did the right thing by settling peace and avoiding full-blown war with a well-established, powerful country, while we're this young upstart with no real military or navy to speak of, he makes the right choice, but unfortunately for Adams, it does cost him politically. Both parties view him as making a mistake and not doing what we should have in declaring war. So he is hated by his own party for not declaring war. So poor John Adams is basically ruined by this decision. And then you have Federalists recognizing the growing power of the Jeffersonian Party. So, in order to limit their chances of losing Congress and the presidency in 1800, they pass a couple laws to silence the supporters of Jefferson's party. First, and less important, is the Alien Act, which raised immigrants' residency requirements to 14 years. This meant that they could not vote for quite a long time because citizenship is required. Also, the president, by this act, would be allowed to deport those foreigners viewed as dangerous, or basically, this was seen as silencing again political opponents. So, you then have the Sedition Act, which, for the sake of our class and discussion, is the more important of the two. This meant that the government could punish those, put them in prison, or fine them heavily for those who defamed or spoke bad about government officials or tried to slow down their policies. This was an attack on freedom of speech and freedom of the press. In fact, the most famous case is someone making fun of John Adams' large rear end. And because of that, he was placed in prison for a few days and fined some money. So even just talking bad about his physical characteristics could lead to punishment. So when Adams signs these laws into action, it allows Federalists to control the newspapers and manipulate the anti-French hysteria, but it also makes a lot of people angry, among them Jefferson and Madison. They believe that this was becoming a one-party dictatorship, as people's individual rights guaranteed by the First Amendment were being infringed upon. So Jefferson and Madison, write two separate resolutions for two southern states, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. These two resolutions claimed that the nation was the creation of the states, so states were the final judge on federal government overstepping their authority. When you think about, again, that 10th Amendment, since their rights were named in the amendments, and the government does not have the right to silence criticism. They believe that they had the right to stop the federal government from doing this. So this right is known as nullification. Nullification means that you can cancel out a law. They believe that states had the right to nullify any laws that the federal government passed that they did not like, especially things like the Alien and Sedition Acts that they thought took away their rights guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. So no other states followed them, although they expected them to. And Federalists argue that the Supreme Court is the one who had the decision on constitutionality. But why this event is so important, yes, you can say we stood up to the removal of our rights, but the biggest reason is that Jefferson and Madison's resolutions become the key to defending states' rights. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions will be used by southern states in the nullification crisis, in which they try to nullify a massive tariff of 1828. And then you also have them using the idea of nullification when others begin threatening to eliminate slavery. So these resolutions and the idea of nullification are big steps in defending states' rights and will also be a big reason why we end up having a civil war. So, looking at these two political parties that form in our early years, the Federalists and Democratic Republicans, I want to highlight some of those that will stand out and, yes, will be on your quiz as well. So, the ones that stand out the most as far as what we saw in this chapter. So, you see the first one there, rule by the best people. are what Federalists believed, and the Democratic Republicans believe that we should be ruled by the informed masses. The third one, the Federalists believed in a powerful central government at the expense of states' rights. Democratic Republicans instead supported the idea of a weak central government so as to preserve states' rights, so states over the federal government for them. Loose interpretation of the Constitution. Number 4, Federalists believed that the federal government could do things that were necessary and proper, whereas the Jeffersonians believed that you had to only, or the federal government could only do what was explicitly stated. Thus, they strictly interpreted it. Next, we have the Federalists generally favoring a British stance. That's because it would help out our economy and they'd be good trading partners. That's why we get Jay's Treaty. Meanwhile, Democratic Republicans supported the idea of supporting the French and their revolution because it represented our ideology as well. Beyond that, you have, of course, the central bank the Federalists supported. Meanwhile, the Democratic Republicans believe that the state should be the ones to manage our economy unless they encourage state banks. And then finally, the last thing to really focus on is where are these parties located? The Federalists were mostly concentrated in seacoast areas. If you remember in previous chapters, we called this the coastal elite. For the Democratic Republicans, they were concentrated in the South and Southwest, in agricultural areas and backcountry. What this tells you about the future, as the nation moves westward, the Federalists are going to fall out of favor because the majority of Americans will not be located in the seacoast area. Rather, they will be moving west as farmers, and they will support the Democratic Republicans. Anyway, that does it for Chapter 10. That's a lot of information, so make sure you study. Watch the key question videos, which is a much more succinct look at the chapter. And if you have any questions, feel free to message me. Have a great day.